I'm a park ranger on the night shift. The rules are not what you'd expect. There's something they don't tell you when you take the night shift as a park ranger. Not everything in the forest belongs to this world. I thought this job would just be about patrols, checking campsites, and making sure no tourists did anything stupid in the dark. But then I started noticing there were strange rules I was expected to follow, rules that weren't in any official manual, but were burned into the warnings of veteran rangers. Never stare too long at the glowing eyes in the dark, even if you're sure they belong to an animal. If you hear someone calling your name from deep in the forest, keep walking. Don't answer. There's a trail that isn't on any map. If you see it, turn around immediately. At first, I thought these were just scary stories meant to spook the rookies. But then, one night, I broke one of the rules, and I wish I never had. Are you ready to hear the truth about my night shift? Subscribe to Mr. Quentin for more terrifying stories from the world we were never meant to know. I had just accepted a job as a forest ranger in a place that didn't exist on any map. It was remote, untouched, and eerily silent. On my first day, they handed me a card, plain, worn, but with strict rules printed in bold letters. Rules for survival. Do not speak about the forest, ever. Never step off the trail, no matter what you see or hear. If you hear a child crying, keep walking. Do not look for them. Do not help them. Stay away from the northern ridge, no exceptions, and most importantly, follow every rule if you want to make it out alive. That night, as the wind whispered through the trees, I realized something chilling. These weren't just warnings. They were my only chance to survive. I had been given clear instructions. Do not speak about the forest. Stay on the trail. Ignore the crying children. Avoid the northern ridge. Obey the rules if you want to survive. On my first night, I broke none of them. But I still came close to dying. Night 1. The silence and the presence. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest changed. The sounds of rustling leaves, distant chirping, and the occasional whispering breeze vanished, as if the entire world had been muted. It wasn't just quiet. It was unnatural, suffocating. My own breathing sounded deafening, and every step I took felt intrusive, as though I was being watched. I had been warned that if the forest went completely silent, I needed to hide. I barely made it in time. There was an old tree near my cabin, one that had a strange symbol carved into its bark, a circle with jagged edges, like the sun with broken rays. I didn't know what it meant, but instinct told me to trust it. Pressing myself against its rough trunk, I crouched low, heart pounding. Then I felt it. Something was behind me, not touching me, not breathing down my neck, but there. Its presence was suffocating, a void where something should not be. I didn't dare turn around. My fingers gripped the bark so hard I thought my nails might snap. It didn't move. It didn't speak. But I knew, if I made a sound, if I even acknowledged its existence, I wouldn't survive the night. I stayed there for hours, frozen in place, until the sounds of the forest returned. Only then did I stumble back to my cabin, drenched in cold sweat. The first night had been a warning. Night 2. The twitching thing and the green eyes. I followed the rules again the second night, but it didn't matter. The forest had noticed me. As I patrolled the trail with my flashlight, I saw it, a figure at the edge of my vision, hunched and unnatural. It moved in a series of erratic, jerking motions, like a puppet with tangled strings, its limbs bent the wrong way. I raised my flashlight, and the second the beam hit it, darkness. The light cut out. My breath caught in my throat. Then, tiny green lights flickered in the trees around me. At first, I thought they were fireflies, but they didn't blink or move naturally. They multiplied rapidly, forming clusters, surrounding me. I ran. I don't know how long I sprinted through the dark, guided only by instinct. The green lights chased me, shifting in and out of my peripheral vision, always watching. When I finally reached my cabin, I slammed the door shut. My flashlight flickered back on. The green eyes were gone, but something told me they would be back. Night 3. The Crying Child and the Truth. I made my first real mistake on the third night. A child was crying in the woods, a little girl. I knew the rule: ignore it, keep walking, do not look, do not help. But something about her voice cracked something inside me. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was guilt, maybe I just couldn't stand the idea of leaving a child to whatever horrors lurked in this place. I stepped off the trail. The moment I did, I felt the shift. The air became heavier, charged with something ancient and malevolent. The trees seemed taller, their shadows stretching unnaturally. I found her near a fallen tree, small, fragile, sobbing into her hands. "It's okay," I whispered, crouching down. "I'm here to help." She looked up. Her eyes weren't human. They were too big, too dark, filled with something that wasn't sorrow, but hunger. Her mouth twisted, stretching too wide, revealing too many teeth. Her sobs turned into laughter, wet and gurgling. Then she lunged. I barely escaped. I don't even remember how I made it back to my cabin, only that my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't lock the door at first. Outside, she giggled. I didn't sleep that night. Day 4. The Forbidden Ridge. I should have quit. Should have left that cursed place the moment the sun rose. Instead, I broke the final rule. Maybe I was desperate for answers. Maybe I thought daylight would protect me. But I climbed the northern ridge. The trees thinned as I reached the top, revealing something that shouldn't exist. A perfect circle of stones, each one carved with strange symbols. The air here was different, charged with something powerful. Then, the shadows stretched unnaturally. It emerged from the trees, tall, featureless. A figure of pure darkness, with no face, no defining features, just an overwhelming sense of wrongness. It moved toward me, deliberate, unstoppable. But it couldn't enter the circle. I stood frozen as it loomed just beyond the stones, its presence pressing against an invisible barrier. It didn't speak, but somehow I understood. "You are not supposed to be here." I turned and ran. The aftermath. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even turn off the lights. I sat in my cabin, gripping the card of rules so tightly it crumpled in my hands. I had broken the rules. The forest knew, and it was only a matter of time before it came to collect. I didn't sleep. After breaking the rules, after standing face to face with whatever lived in the northern ridge, I sat in my cabin, gripping the rule card like it was a lifeline. My body was still trembling, my skin slick with cold sweat. I had made too many mistakes, and I knew, deep in my bones, that the forest would not forgive me. The black mark morning arrived in a slow, heavy silence, the kind that felt unnatural, as if the world was holding its breath. I dragged myself to the bathroom, exhaustion weighing me down. My reflection in the mirror was barely recognizable. Pale skin, dark circles under my eyes, the haunted look of someone who had seen too much. That's when I saw it. A mark. Right over my chest, just above my heart, was a deep black imprint. It wasn't a bruise nor a wound, but something far worse. The shape was disturbingly familiar, jagged interlocking symbols like the ones carved into the trees, like the ones etched into the stones of the northern ridge. I touched it. A sharp, electric pain shot through my veins, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The room spun. My vision blurred. I collapsed to my knees, gripping the sink for balance. I scrubbed at the mark, hard. But no matter how much I rubbed, no matter how much soap or water I used, it wouldn't fade. It wasn't on my skin. It was in me. And as I looked into the mirror, I realized something else. The forest felt closer. Not physically, not in any tangible way, but in the way it pressed into my mind. I could feel it in the back of my thoughts, whispering, shifting. The trees outside my window seemed to breathe, their movements too synchronized, too aware. Something had changed. Something inside me had changed. The watcher returns. A knock on my door shattered the silence. I nearly jumped out of my skin. My immediate instinct was to ignore it, to stay hidden. But something in the air told me that wouldn't help. I opened the door. The supervisor was there, the same man who had given me the rule card on my first day, the same man who had warned me to follow every instruction without question. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes flickered down to my chest for the briefest moment. He knew. Without a word, he handed me something. Another card. I took it hesitantly, heart pounding. The rules were the same as before. Do not speak about the forest. Do not step off the path. Ignore the crying. Stay away from the northern ridge. But there was a new rule now. The final line stood out, bold and suffocating. Those who bear the mark cannot leave the forest. I felt my stomach drop. I looked back up at the supervisor, desperate for an answer, an explanation. But he simply stepped back, his face impassive. "You should have followed the rules," he said quietly. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. The forest's claim. I slammed the door shut, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My mind screamed at me to deny it, to refuse what the words implied, but deep down, I already knew the truth. I couldn't leave. I didn't know how. I didn't know why. But I felt it, like an invisible chain wrapping around my soul, binding me to this cursed place. The moment I thought about running, about stepping beyond the edge of the forest, my chest burned. The mark pulsed, spreading an agonizing heat through my veins, as if the very thought of escape triggered something ancient and unforgiving. I stumbled back, gripping my shirt, breathing heavily. This was a prison, and I was now a part of it. The whispering trees. The day passed in a blur. I didn't patrol. I didn't check the trails. I sat in my cabin, staring at the new rule card, waiting for something to happen. And when the sun began to set, the forest spoke. Not in words, not in voices, but in movement. The trees outside my window shifted, their branches bending toward my cabin. The wind carried a sound that wasn't quite rustling leaves, wasn't quite whispers, but something in between. A low, murmuring hum, like hundreds of unseen eyes whispering among themselves. Watching me, judging me, claiming me. I pressed my back against the wall, hands clenched into fists. My mind screamed at me to fight, to resist whatever was happening, but part of me, some deep, primal part, knew it was useless. I had broken the rules. I had crossed the boundaries, and now the forest had decided. I wasn't an outsider anymore. I belonged to it. What comes next? I don't know what happens now. I don't know if I'll change, if I'll become like the things that lurk in the trees. Maybe I already have. Maybe that's why the forest isn't trying to scare me away anymore. Maybe that's why the whispers don't feel foreign anymore. Maybe that's why, when I close my eyes, I can understand what they're saying. I had to try. Even with the mark on my chest, even with the rules screaming at me that it was impossible, I refused to accept my fate. I was not going to be another lost soul claimed by this forest. I waited until nightfall. The escape plan. The forest was alive in the dark, but I had no choice. If I tried to leave during the day, the supervisor might stop me, or worse, the forest itself might manipulate me into staying, sinking deeper into its grasp. I packed what little I could carry: water, a flashlight, my knife, and the rule card that had sealed my fate. It felt like a cruel joke now, a contract I had unknowingly signed. But I didn't care. I stepped out of the cabin, heart pounding in my ears. The trees loomed over me, their branches twisting unnaturally, as if they knew. as if they were waiting to see what I would do. I took a deep breath. And I ran. The forest reacts. The trail blurred beneath my feet as I sprinted. The branches clawed at my arms. The roots seemed to shift beneath my steps, but I pushed forward. I didn't know where the exact boundary of the forest was, but I had a general idea. If I could just reach the main road, if I could just cross that invisible threshold, maybe the mark wouldn't matter. Maybe I could still be free. But the moment I neared the edge, the forest changed. The air thickened, pressing against my chest like an invisible weight. The distant whispering became a roar, a cacophony of voices, of warnings, of anger, and then the shadows moved. Dark figures emerged from the trees, shifting and writhing like living voids. They had no faces, no eyes, yet I felt their gaze lock onto me. I kept running, faster. The ground trembled beneath my feet. The trees groaned and bent unnaturally, their trunks twisting to form barriers. The very path I was taking was changing, reshaping itself to keep me trapped. And then I saw it. The creature from the ridge. The guardian of the boundary. It was waiting for me at the forest's edge. Taller than any human, its form was obscured by shadows, shifting between something humanoid and something utterly wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements too smooth, as if the rules of reality didn't apply to it. It was the forest, or at least an extension of it, and it would not let me leave. I skidded to a stop, panting, heart pounding against my ribs. The thing took a single step toward me, and the weight of its presence nearly crushed me. My chest burned. I screamed, clutching the mark over my heart as searing pain erupted from it. It wasn't just pain, it was pulling me, dragging me backward, away from the boundary, away from escape. I fought it, clawing at the dirt, trying to push forward, but the force was too strong. The mark pulsed like a living brand, its symbols glowing an eerie, sickly light. The shadows closed in around me, the trees shifted, and suddenly the path back to my cabin was the only road that existed. I had no choice. I stumbled to my feet, defeated, and turned back. The thing didn't follow me. It didn't need to. I had learned my lesson. The realization. When I reached my cabin, I collapsed onto the wooden floor, gasping for air. The pain in my chest faded, but the mark still throbbed, as if mocking me. I was a prisoner. The final rule was absolute. Those who bear the mark cannot leave the forest. It wasn't just a warning, it was a fact. The forest had claimed me, and no matter how hard I fought, no matter what I tried, there was no escaping it. I wasn't sure what was worse, the fear of what would happen to me next, or the growing part of me that no longer wanted to leave. There was no point in fighting anymore. I had tried to escape. I had defied the rules. I had clung to the last shreds of my humanity, refusing to accept what was happening to me. But the forest had decided, and now, so had I. The changes begin. The first thing I noticed was the hunger, or rather, the lack of it. I hadn't eaten in days, yet I wasn't weak. My body didn't ache from exhaustion, and my stomach never growled. The need for food, for sleep, for warmth, all the things that had once defined my existence, were fading. At first I thought it was adrenaline, some kind of survival instinct taking over, but deep down, I knew better. I was changing. Hearing the whispers. The forest spoke to me now, not in words, not in voices, but in something older, something deeper. The rustling of the leaves wasn't random. The creaking of the branches carried meaning. It wasn't just wind, it was language, and I understood it. The whispers no longer sent shivers down my spine. They felt familiar, like the murmur of a crowd I had always been a part of, but had never learned to listen to. Until now. At night I would sit outside my cabin, surrounded by the darkness, letting the voices weave through my mind. They told me things, secrets of the forest, names of things that had no names, stories of those who had come before me and those who would come after. They told me the truth. I had never been meant to leave. A different kind of presence. The animals knew it too. The first time it happened, I was out on the trail, walking without direction, just listening. A deer emerged from the trees, its massive antlers casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. It should have run, but it didn't. It just stood there, watching me. Its dark eyes reflected something unspoken, something ancient. It recognized me, not as a threat, not as a human, but as something else. Days passed. Birds landed on my shoulders without hesitation. Foxes darted between my legs, unafraid. Even the nocturnal creatures, the ones that shouldn't exist, the ones whose glowing eyes had once haunted me in the dark, now simply watched me, not with malice, but with acceptance. I had stopped being an outsider. I was one of them now. The final night. I don't know why I climbed the ridge that night. Maybe the whispers guided me. Maybe the mark on my chest, now fully fused with my skin, pulsed in rhythm with something calling me. Or maybe I simply knew where I needed to go. The path was clear, though it had never been before. The trees didn't shift to block my way. The air was still. Even the sky, which had once seemed endless, felt smaller now, like the forest itself had grown around me, enclosing me within its embrace. The stone circle was waiting. I stepped inside. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, the world around me vanished. The trees blurred into a mass of swirling darkness. The wind picked up, carrying voices that were no longer whispers, but chants, deep, resonant, vibrating through my bones. The ground beneath me pulsed, alive. The symbols carved into the stones glowed, their meaning sinking into my mind without words. This was not a prison. This was a threshold, and I had reached the point of no return. Becoming the forest. The shadows moved. They weren't hunting me this time. They weren't lurking in the corners of my vision, waiting to consume me. They welcomed me. I felt them wrap around my body, not as chains, but as something else. Something ancient, something eternal. My skin prickled. My breath hitched. The mark on my chest flared with a final burst of heat before settling into something calm, something right. I let go. The last thing I remember was the darkness closing in, the forest pulling me into its depths, and the quiet realization that I was no longer a ranger. I was no longer a man. I was part of the forest now. And the forest never lets go.